2 hours before walking down the aisle to marry one of Manhattan's most powerful men, Serena Holloway did the one thing she swore she would never do. She unlocked a number she had buried for 5 years and typed 7 words that would unravel everything she had built, everything she had survived, and everything she had convinced herself she no longer wanted. If you still want me, come find me. No explanation, no context, just 7 words sent into the dark toward a man the world feared and she had never stopped loving. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. The dress was ivory silk, hand-stitched by an atelier in Paris that Damien Ashcroft had flown to New York specifically for the fitting. It cost more than most people earned in 3 years. It fit Serena Holloway like a second skin, which was exactly the problem. Standing in front of the full-length mirror inside her private dressing room at the Whitmore, Manhattan's oldest and most ruthlessly exclusive hotel, Serena looked at the woman reflected back at her and felt nothing that resembled happiness. She felt cold. She felt the particular coldness that comes not from temperature but from knowing something you cannot unknow. 48 hours earlier, she had been sitting alone in Damien's penthouse study, waiting for him to return from a dinner she had not been invited to. That had been happening more frequently in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Private dinners. Closed doors. Conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. She had told herself it was pre-wedding business, the kind of corporate restructuring that demanded discretion. Damien ran 7 legitimate holding companies spanning 3 continents. There was always something demanding his attention that could not include her. But that night she had been restless in a way she could not explain, the kind of restlessness that lives below conscious thought, somewhere in the body rather than the mind. She had walked to his desk without any particular intention. The laptop had been left open. She hadn't gone looking for anything. She needed to tell herself that now, standing in the wedding dress, because the alternative, that some part of her had always suspected, was a weight she wasn't ready to carry. The screen had been opened to a financial dashboard unlike anything connected to his legitimate businesses. She recognized the interface because her father had worked in structured finance for 30 years before his health collapsed, and she had grown up watching numbers move across screens exactly like this one. But these numbers were moving in patterns she had never seen in anything legal. Layered transfers, ghost corporations nested inside ghost corporations, payments routed through jurisdictions that existed specifically to erase their origins. She had photographed 47 screens with her phone before she heard the elevator engage at the end of the hall. She closed the laptop and was standing at the window with a glass of water in her hand when Damien walked in. He had kissed her forehead, asked if she'd eaten, told her she looked tired and that she should rest because the next week would be exhausting. She had smiled and said goodnight. She had not slept. By 3 a.m, she was in her own apartment across the park, running the photographs through every financial analysis tool she had access to from her work as a forensic account consultant. By 5, she had confirmed enough to make her stomach turn. By 6, she had copied everything to an encrypted external drive using a protocol her late father had taught her when she was 22, and he had been terrified that something from his past might reach her. She had never understood why he taught her that protocol. Standing now in the ivory dress with 40 minutes remaining before she was supposed to walk into the grand ballroom downstairs and speak vows in front of 400 people, senators, executives, federal judges, men and women who appeared in the pages of financial publications and whose names she now recognized from the records she had spent 2 sleepless nights decoding. Serena understood her father perfectly. His debt hadn't been the kind that got forgiven. It had been the kind that got transferred. She turned away from the mirror. Her maid of honor, a woman named Claire, who had been her closest friend since college, was standing near the door holding a small bouquet of white roses and looking at Serena with the kind of careful expression that meant she had noticed something was wrong but hadn't yet decided whether to ask. "You need water?" Claire said. "I need 5 minutes alone." Claire looked at the flowers, then at the door, then at Serena's face. Whatever she saw there was enough. She set the bouquet on the vanity table, squeezed Serena's hand once without speaking, and walked out. The moment the latch clicked, Serena sat down on the edge of the velvet bench in front of the vanity and picked up her phone. Not the one Damien had given her, the new one. thin and silent and always fully charged, that his assistant refreshed every 3 months. Her own phone. The one she paid for with her own account. The one where, buried inside a locked folder, she still had a contact saved under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might look. 5 years. She had not contacted him in 5 years. She had not allowed herself to. The letter he left, 3 paragraphs, handwritten on plain paper, no return address, had been precise in the way that only someone who understood the weight of words could be precise. He was not coming back. She should not wait. He was sorry. That was all. She had read it 4 times, then folded it into the back of a book she never opened again, and she had built the next 5 years on top of it, the way you build a house, on a foundation you hope will hold. Her thumb hovered over the number. She had told herself many things about Adrian Moretti over the past 5 years. That he was dangerous in ways that her life couldn't absorb. That his disappearance had been a kindness, even if it hadn't felt like one. That whatever they had been to each other existed in a category of experience she could honor without returning to. She had told herself these things so many times that she had almost started to believe them. She typed the message before she could think herself out of it. "If you still want me, come find me." She pressed send. Then she sat very still, listening to the sounds of Manhattan 40 stories below, and waited for nothing in particular because she had no logical expectation that anything would happen. The number might be dead. He might be dead. 5 years in the life he led was long enough for almost anything. She set the phone face down on the vanity and looked at herself in the mirror again. The door opened without a knock. Not Claire. Not her mother, who was already seated downstairs. Not any of the hotel staff. The man who stepped through the door wore a dark overcoat over a charcoal suit, no tie, and the particular expression of someone who had been moving quickly but was determined not to appear to be. Snow on his shoulders barely melted. He had come from outside. He had come fast. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered, and there were new lines at the corners of his eyes. But the eyes themselves were exactly the same, the particular shade of brown that had always looked darker than it was, watchful in a way that went beyond trained habit into something biological, as though every room he entered got catalogued and assessed at a speed below conscious thought. Adrian Moretti stood in the doorway of her dressing room and looked at her in the wedding dress, and something crossed his face that was too complicated to name and too brief to examine. "You called," he said quietly. Serena's breath caught in a way she hadn't expected. She had been so focused on sending the message, so certain in the 2 hours since that nothing would come of it, that she had not fully prepared for the reality of him standing in front of her. "How are you even here?" she said. It came out flat. Not quite a question. "I was already in the city." He stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind him. His eyes moved across the room once, door, windows, connecting hallway, and then came back to her. "Why are you still in this room?" "Because I'm supposed to get married in 35 minutes. "I know what you're supposed to do." He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood close enough that she could smell cold air, and something underneath it, wool, and something indefinably him, unchanged by 5 years in a way that wasn't fair. "Why did you send that message?" She held his gaze. "Because 3 days ago I found something." The shift in his expression was minor and immediate. He didn't ask what. He waited. That was the thing about Adrian Moretti that she had spent 5 years trying to forget. He never filled silence with noise. He never asked the obvious question. He simply waited. And the patience in that waiting was not comfortable. It was the patience of someone who already suspected the answer and was giving you the space to arrive at it yourself. "Damien's companies," she said, "the shell structure, the layered transfers. I copied everything to a drive." She moved to the vanity and opened the small cosmetics bag on the left side of the surface, removing a flat encrypted drive no larger than a credit card. She held it out. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it, then at her face. "You've had this for 3 days, he said. "Yes." "And you still showed up to the hotel this morning." "I needed to be certain I hadn't misread it." "And?" "I'm certain." He took the drive. His fingers didn't touch hers, which she noticed the way you notice small omissions when your nervous system is paying attention to everything. He looked at it for a moment, then slid it into his interior jacket pocket. "How many people know you found this?" "No one." Does he suspect anything? Not that I could tell. Adrian looked at her for a moment in a way that had no softness in it and no particular hardness either. It was the look of a man doing a fast and serious calculation. You need to change out of that dress. Adrian, there's a service exit on the east end of this floor. My car is already positioned. You have about 6 minutes before someone comes to find you, and another 20 before Damien's people realize the timeline is disrupted. He paused. If you're coming, you need to move now. If you're not coming, he stopped. She waited. Then give me the drive back and I'll walk out of here and handle this a different way. And you can marry him and spend the rest of your life knowing what you know. The honesty in that was brutal, in the way that only Adrian could be brutal. Not cruel, but completely without softness, stripped of the kind of cushioning that made difficult things easier to accept. He was giving her the actual choice, not the version of it that had a clear right answer built in. Serena reached behind her and found the top button of the dress. Her hands were not shaking. She found that remarkable. Everything inside her was moving fast and loud, but her hands were absolutely steady, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was her father's daughter in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Turn around, she said. Something moved through his expression. He turned. She worked the buttons quickly. There were 11 of them, hand-stitched, the kind that required a button hook and time she did not have. She managed the top 7, then reached for the emergency bag she had packed 2 nights ago and left behind the second rack of towels in the bathroom. Not a bag she'd packed thinking she would actually use it. The kind you pack because you were raised by a man who understood that the moments when you most need to leave are the moments you least expect. Dark trousers, flat shoes, a cream-colored blouse, nothing that looked like someone who had been dressed for a wedding. She changed in 40 seconds, left the ivory dress on the bench like a shed skin, and walked back into the main room. Adrian turned when she appeared. He looked at her face rather than what she was wearing. Ready? She said. He nodded once and moved to the door. The hallway outside was quiet in the specific way that expensive hotels manage during large-scale private events. All the noise redistributed to the floors and rooms hosting the occasion, leaving the peripheral corridors with a silence that felt like held breath. Serena followed Adrian at a pace that was fast without looking hurried, past the floral arrangements that Damien's event team had spent a week installing, past the closed doors of rooms occupied by the family members and guests who had traveled from 3 continents for the ceremony that would not happen. The service corridor at the east end of the floor smelled of industrial detergent and old carpet. Adrian pushed through a door marked staff only, and she was behind him without hesitation. The stairwell beyond was undecorated concrete, flickering fluorescent light. The sound of their footsteps different in here, real and unpadded, nothing like the hushed acoustics of the hotel's public spaces. They moved down 4 flights without speaking. At the ground floor landing, Adrian paused with his hand on the door and looked back at her once, not checking whether she was keeping up. Something else. The names on that drive, he said. Some of them I'm going to recognize. She looked at him steadily. I know. His jaw shifted slightly. He turned back and pushed the door open. The cold hit her immediately. The specific cold of Manhattan in February, the kind that finds every gap in your clothing and exploits it. The service door opened onto a narrow side street that ran between the hotel and the building adjacent to it, already in shadow at this hour, no pedestrians visible. A black car with tinted windows was idling 20 feet away. The driver, a large man with a calm face who gave no indication that anything about this situation was unusual, had already started moving the moment the door opened. Serena got into the car. Adrian got in beside her and the door closed and the car moved without any instruction given, which meant the instruction had already been given, which meant he had known, at some point before she contacted him, or immediately after, exactly what exit he would use and exactly where the car would be. She sat in the leather seat and watched the narrow street give way to a wider one, then watched the wider one dissolve into the crawl of midtown traffic. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. 7 missed calls from Damien's assistant, 3 from Claire, 1 from a number she didn't recognize that somehow felt formal even as a missed call notification. She turned the phone off and put it in her coat pocket. Adrian was looking out the opposite window. His profile was calm in the way of someone who had operated in high-pressure situations for long enough that calm had become a physical default rather than an emotional state. She remembered that about him. She remembered it now with a clarity that was almost physical, the way certain memories live in the body rather than the mind. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere he won't look immediately." He paused. "I have a place on the coast. 3 hours. And then?" He finally looked at her directly. "And then we look at what you took from him and figure out how bad this actually is." The car turned onto a crosstown street and began moving east, away from the hotel, away from the ballroom where 400 people were now beginning to understand that the wedding would not be starting on time. Through the tinted window, Serena watched the city slide past. Gray February light on glass buildings. People moving on sidewalks with the purposeful urgency of people who had ordinary things to do on an ordinary Saturday. And she thought about the drive in Adrian's jacket pocket and the names she had spent 2 nights memorizing and what it meant that several of those names, people Damien had introduced to her as colleagues and associates at dinners she had attended on his arm for 3 years, had appeared in transactions she could only describe as payments for violence. She thought about her father. She thought about the debt he had carried for the last decade of his life, the weight that had aged him faster than illness, the apologies that had lived in his eyes whenever he looked at her. She had understood the apologies as guilt over his failed health, his inability to be the father he had wanted to be after her mother left. She understood them differently now. The car accelerated as it reached the bridge approach. Manhattan fell away behind them. Serena looked at the back of the driver's head, then at Adrian's hands resting quietly on his knee, then at the gray water visible beneath the bridge structure. She had not sent that message because she had a plan. She had sent it because standing in the wedding dress with 47 photographs of evidence and a dead man's debt and 400 guests in a ballroom below her, she had understood. Suddenly and completely, and without any room for comfortable interpretation, that the only person in the world she trusted with all of it was the person she had spent 5 years trying to stop trusting. That was either the clearest thought she'd ever had or the most dangerous one. She wasn't sure yet whether those were different things. The bridge gave way to the highway, and the city disappeared, and the car moved north through February gray toward a coast she had never seen, carrying an encrypted drive that had already made both of them targets, and Serena Holloway pressed her back against the leather seat and breathed and did not allow herself to look back. Because looking back was how you missed what was already in front of you. And what was in front of her, she understood this with the part of herself that had always been sharper than she let people see, was not safety. What was in front of her was the moment when everything on that drive would have to be answered for, when the names she had memorized would have to be confronted, when the full shape of what Damien had built would become impossible to look away from, and when Adrian Moretti, sitting 2 feet away from her in a moving car with her message still warm in his phone, would have to explain why the first time she'd looked closely at that encrypted network, 3 of the largest transfers had routed through accounts she now recognized as belonging to the Moretti family. She had not mentioned that yet. She was waiting to see how long it took him to tell her himself. The car had been moving for 2 hours when Serena decided she was done waiting. She had spent the first hour watching the highway unspool through the tinted window, counting the mile markers, letting the silence between them accumulate the way silence does when 2 people are each waiting for the other to speak first. The driver had not said a word. The radio stayed off. Adrian sat with his left elbow on the armrest and his right hand resting on his knee, and if the tension in the car registered anywhere in his body, she could not find it. That was what finally made her speak. Not anger, not fear. The simple fact that his calm was too complete, and she had spent enough time studying financial records to understand that when something looks perfectly composed on the surface, the architecture underneath is usually what requires the most attention. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." The transfers routed through the Cayman accounts in the 3rd cluster, the ones dated between March and November 4 years ago. She kept her voice even. "I recognize the holding structure, the layering pattern. It matches the Moretti family's external investment framework." The silence that followed was exactly 3 seconds long. She counted. "Where did you see the Moretti framework?" he said. "My father showed me. He consulted for your family's legitimate operations for 18 months before his health declined. He brought work home sometimes. I was 24 and curious, and he never thought to tell me not to look. Adrian turned his head and looked at her directly for the first time since the car had left the city. His expression had not changed in any way she could measure, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A recalibration, quick and precise. The kind that happens when a man who is used to controlling information realizes the information has already moved past him. "How much do you understand about what those transfers were?" he said. "Enough to know they weren't clean." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have until you give me the context that explains them." She held his gaze. "So, give me the context, Adrian." He looked at her for a moment longer, then looked forward at the back of the driver's headrest. His jaw shifted once. She had learned in the time she had known him years ago that the jaw shift was the tell, the one physical indication that he was working through something he would rather not say aloud. 4 years ago, Damien approached the family with a co-investment proposal, he said. Clean on paper. Real estate development across 3 European markets. My father was still running primary operations at that point, and he approved the partnership before I had full visibility into Damien's broader structure. And when you got full visibility, I shut it down. But the transfers had already happened. Yes. Which means Damien has documentation connecting your family to his network. The pause this time was shorter. Yes. Serena leaned back in her seat and looked at the ceiling of the car. The leather was soft and dark and completely indifferent to any of this. She felt something move through her that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite despair. It was the particular sensation of watching a picture you thought you understood reveal another layer underneath, and then another underneath that, and understanding that the layers were not going to stop appearing. Is that why you disappeared? She said. 5 years ago. Was it because of Damien? Partly. What's the other part? He was quiet for long enough that she turned her head and looked at him. There was a war inside the family, he said. 2 factions. My uncle believed the organization needed to expand aggressively into new territory. I believe that path ended in federal indictments within 3 years. He paused. To consolidate my position as head of the family, I needed to remove every vulnerability my uncle's people could weaponize against me. Every personal attachment, every exposed flank. I was an exposed flank. He didn't soften it. Yes. She nodded slowly. The car moved through a stretch of highway that ran alongside salt marshes, brown and flat under the February sky. Dormant grass, still water, a landscape that looked like it was waiting for something. The letter you left, she said. I wrote it 6 times. It was very final. That was the point. Were you ever going to? She stopped herself before the sentence finished, because finishing it would require a kind of vulnerability she hadn't decided to offer yet. Adrian looked at her. Were you going to ask if I was ever going to come back? She said nothing. I don't know, he said, and the honesty in it was rougher than she expected, less composed than anything else he'd said. I told myself no. It was cleaner that way. For you. He stopped. For me, it was considerably less clean. The car slowed and took an exit she hadn't been watching for. The highway gave way to a 2-lane road lined with bare trees. The branches interlocked overhead in a way that turned the gray sky into a pattern of fractured light. Serena looked at the road and said nothing, and Adrian said nothing. And the driver took 3 turns in sequence without any instruction, and she understood they were close to wherever they were going. The estate appeared at the end of a gravel drive flanked by winter-brown hedgerows. A large stone structure, 2 stories, built in the style of coastal New England houses that were designed to take weather seriously. No ornamentation. Deep-set windows. A broad porch with no furniture visible because all of it had been put away for winter. The kind of house that looked unoccupied to anyone who didn't know better, and was maintained with the precise care of a property that needed to be ready at any time. The car stopped. They got out. The air off the water was different from city air, heavier with salt, colder in a way that went into the lungs rather than just the skin. Serena stood for a moment on the gravel and oriented herself. The ocean was audible somewhere past the east side of the house. Inside, the house had the smell of a well-maintained space that had been recently opened, a faint mustiness layered beneath fresh air from opened windows. The main room was large and sparsely furnished with heavy practical pieces, no decorative excess. A fireplace with a prepared grate, a long table near the south windows that faced the water. 3 men she didn't know had already been positioned at intervals around the first floor, men who occupied the space the way Adrian's people always occupied space, quietly and with an orientation toward every entry point. Adrian crossed to the table and set his phone down, then shrugged off his overcoat and draped it over a chair. He looked at one of the men and said something brief in Italian that Serena caught enough of to understand meant establish the perimeter. The man left. The other 2 redistributed themselves without being told. Adrian held out his hand. She looked at it. "The drive," he said. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket since he had handed it back to her in the car. She had palmed it during the conversation without making a production of it, a habit she had developed in childhood from a father who believed that the most important things should always be closest to your own hand. She had been waiting to see how long it took him to notice he no longer had it. It had taken 40 minutes. He was watching her with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite irritation. "Good," he said quietly. "You kept it." She put it in his hand. He crossed to a cabinet near the fireplace and removed a laptop. He connected the drive and sat at the table, and Serena sat across from him, and for the next 2 hours they went through everything she had copied. What emerged over those 2 hours was not the picture she had understood from her own analysis alone. What emerged was larger. Damien's network of shell corporations wasn't built for financial concealment in the conventional sense. It was built for control. Payments that looked like investment returns were actually structural payments maintaining silence from judges, union officials, Port Authority administrators, and 3 sitting members of a federal oversight committee. Shipping routes that appeared to belong to legitimate freight companies were handling cargo that never appeared on any manifest. The ghost corporations weren't just moving money, they were moving the conditions under which certain decisions got made or didn't get made at every level of legal and commercial infrastructure across 5 major American cities. Adrian sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. "He's been building this for 20 years, he said. "The oldest transfers I found go back 23. And he was going to marry you. My father borrowed heavily from one of Damien's legitimate credit vehicles 11 years ago. I found the loan documentation buried in the 4th cluster. The terms included a clause that transferred personal liability to immediate family in the event of default." She kept her voice flat because that was the only way to say the next part without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. "My father defaulted 8 years ago. He spent the last 3 years of his life repaying it in a form that isn't recorded in any financial document." Adrian looked at her across the table. "What form?" he said. "Introductions," she said. He had contacts in federal financial oversight from 30 years of legitimate work. Damien needed those contacts neutralized or redirected. "My father spent 3 years making introductions that he thought were professional courtesy, and that turned out to be the mechanism by which 3 federal investigators were quietly moved off cases that would have intersected with Damien's network. He didn't know. He knew enough to apologize to me every time he looked at me in his last 2 years," she said. "He didn't know the full shape of it, but he knew it wasn't clean, and he couldn't stop because the alternative was—" She stopped. "Was me," Adrian said quietly. She looked at him sharply. "The clause in the loan document," he said. "The liability transfer. Damien used that structure specifically with people who had connections he needed. If your father had defaulted without cooperating, the liability would have transferred to you. Damien would have had a legal claim against you, and then he would have appeared in your life as the man who offered to resolve it." He paused, "Which is what happened." The room was very quiet. Outside, the ocean made a low, consistent sound against whatever rocks lay at the base of the property's land. Serena sat with this for a moment. She had understood, in the abstract, that the engagement had not been accidental. She had understood that Damien had known who she was before they met at the charity event in Soho 3 years ago. She had understood, in the 2 nights of analysis before the wedding, that the entire relationship had been constructed rather than organic. Understanding it in the abstract and hearing it laid out in a single clean sequence were different things. She felt something move through her chest. Not grief exactly, not rage exactly, something that contained elements of both and was less manageable than either. He was going to marry me, she said. Why? He had the liability already. He'd already gotten what he needed from my father. Because you're good at what you do, Adrian said. A forensic account consultant with impeccable credentials and a clean record who is also the wife of Damien Ashcroft becomes something extremely useful. You would have audited his legitimate corporations, found them clean, because the criminal architecture is separated from the legitimate structure by 7 layers of shell ownership that only someone with the full picture can trace. And your professional endorsement would have been worth more than any single bribe. She stared at him. He was going to use me to legitimize himself. He's been using you for 3 years, Adrian said, just not yet in the way that would have required a ceremony first. The fire had been started by someone, Bob. She hadn't noticed when, and the room was warmer now, the smell of burning wood mixing with the salt air coming through a slightly open window near the kitchen. She noticed these details the way you notice irrelevant things when your mind is processing something too large to hold all at once. The sound of the fire, the smell of the air, the specific quality of winter light coming through the south windows. Her phone was off. She remembered that. She took it out and turned it on. 41 missed calls. Damien, his assistant, 3 numbers she didn't recognize, Claire 6 times, her mother twice, and 1 text message sent from Damien's personal number 40 minutes after she had left the hotel. No greeting, no punctuation, no elaboration. I know you have it. Give it back and we can discuss this like adults. Don't make this into something you can't recover from. She put the phone on the table face up so Adrian could read it. He read it and said nothing for a moment. He knows it was you, he said. He knows. How fast can he move? He moved in 40 minutes. She looked at him. Fast enough. Adrian stood up. He crossed to the window facing the driveway and stood to one side of it, looking out at an angle that kept him out of the direct line of sight from outside. The gravel drive, the hedgerows, the road beyond, empty and gray. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face. A flicker of something she couldn't read, contained quickly. He answered. Yeah. He listened for 10 seconds. His body stayed still, but the quality of his stillness changed. It became the stillness of a man absorbing information that requires immediate response. How many? He listened again. Don't engage. Bring them inside and lock down the perimeter. He ended the call. He turned from the window. 2 of Damien's people were picked up on the road a quarter-mile out, he said. Surveillance, not assault. He's locating us, not moving yet. He'll move. Yes. Which means we can't wait here. No. He looked at her, and the calculation in his eyes was of a different kind now. Not the financial analysis he'd been doing for the past 2 hours, but the older, harder calculation of a man who had been moving through dangerous situations since he was 17 years old and had survived them all through a combination of instinct and ruthlessness that he had learned over time to trust more than he trusted almost anything else. We need to move first. How? There are people in this city who helped Damien build what you found on that drive. People who don't know he's about to burn everything down, taking us out. People who would reconsider their loyalty to him if they understood the exposure they're carrying. He paused. I can get them in a room. A room. A dinner. Civil on the surface. I've done it before. His voice was flat. You come as my advisor. You know the financial architecture better than anyone. When the conversation turns, and it will turn, you'll need to be ready to present what you found in terms that make the risk of continuing to back Damien more frightening than the risk of withdrawing. She looked at him steadily. You want to use me the same way he was going to use me? No, he said. I want to use what you know. There's a difference. Tell me the difference. He was going to put you in rooms without telling you what the room was for, Adrian said. I'm telling you exactly what the room is for, and I'm asking whether you want to be in it. She held his gaze for a long moment. And if I say no, then I drive you to a location Damien can't reach, and I handle this a different way, and you stay out of it. And the drive, I keep it. and my father's name. He was quiet. Adrian, she said, if you handle this without me, what happens to the documentation connecting my father to Damien's network? It becomes part of the evidence package used against Damien, which means it becomes part of the public record. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She looked at the drive sitting connected to the laptop on the table. 2 nights of her life living inside a flat piece of encrypted metal. Her father's last years, her own last 3 years. The names of 400 guests who had sat in a ballroom waiting for a wedding that was never going to be what any of them thought it was. Set up the dinner, she said. Something moved through his expression. It wasn't relief and it wasn't satisfaction. It was something older and heavier than either. It won't be safe, he said. I know. Damien will find out within hours that I'm making contact with his network. The moment he does, this stops being surveillance and becomes something else. I know that too. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once and picked up his phone. She turned back to the laptop and the drive and the financial architecture of 23 years of organized crime laid out across the screen in front of her, and she began methodically and without rushing to build the presentation that would either dismantle Damien Ashcroft's empire or get them both killed trying. Outside, the ocean moved against the rocks with the same consistency it had always had, indifferent to any of it, and somewhere on the road a quarter-mile away, 2 men in a parked car were already transmitting their location to a man who had spent 23 years making problems disappear, and who would not consider 2 people in a hard drive to be a particularly difficult problem at all. The dinner was set for Thursday. Adrian spent 2 days making calls that Serena was not present for, in rooms she was not invited into, using a phone she had never seen before that appeared on the second morning and disappeared after each session into a drawer that locked from the inside. She understood this was not exclusion for its own sake. This was the architecture of how he operated. Compartmentalized, layered, each person knowing only the portion of the plan they needed to execute their specific role. It was, she had come to understand, not entirely different from the architecture Damien used. The difference was in what the architecture protected. She spent those 2 days working. The dining table became her workspace. She built the presentation in a format she had used in forensic consulting work, clean, sequential, each transaction linked to the next by documented chain of transfer rather than assumption. But she built it for an audience that would not respond to professional detachment. These were men who understood money the way she understood money, which meant they would see through any version of the numbers that wasn't completely honest about the exposure they were carrying. She didn't soften anything. She let the numbers say what the numbers said. On Wednesday evening, Adrian came and stood behind her and read what she had built for 20 minutes without speaking. "This is enough," he said finally. "It's everything. They'll try to poke holes in the transfer documentation. They can try." She clicked to a specific page. "The chain of custody on every transaction is clean because Damien kept meticulous records for his own protection. He needed to be able to prove, internally, that every payment was made and received. Those records are what makes this irrefutable." She paused. "He was too careful in the wrong direction. He documented everything so thoroughly that there's no version of this that ends without criminal exposure for everyone connected to it." Adrian straightened. "Get some sleep." "I'll sleep after Thursday." "You'll be sharper if—" "Adrian." She turned in the chair and looked up at him. "I know what I need. Thank you." He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she didn't try to interpret, then left the room. She worked for 2 more hours and then sat very still at the table, looking at the presentation on the screen and listening to the house settle around her, and the ocean move outside, and the footsteps of Adrian's men doing their rotations at intervals that were professionally spaced. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the last 6 months of his life. Not with the weight of illness, she understood now, but with the specific heaviness of a man carrying a secret that he believed, if revealed, would destroy the one thing he had managed to protect. He had been trying to protect her. He had done it imperfectly, in conditions he hadn't chosen, without telling her what she was being protected from. She found she could not be angry at him for that. She found, instead, a kind of grief that was cleaner than any she had felt at his funeral, because now she understood the full shape of what she was grieving. She closed the laptop and went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, but slept enough. The restaurant Adrian had chosen was not what she expected. She had assumed somewhere private, closed to the public, the kind of location that communicated power through deliberate exclusivity. Instead, it was a working restaurant in a neighborhood of Providence that catered to a clientele that would not look twice at men in expensive suits because expensive suits were unremarkable here. The whole neighborhood ran on old money and older arrangements, the kind that predated any individual family's claim to them. The private room in the back held a table for 8. 6 men were already seated when Adrian and Serena arrived. She in a charcoal dress, him in a dark suit, both of them giving the impression of people for whom this kind of room was familiar ground. She had been in rooms like this before, she realized. 3 years of dinners with Damien had put her in rooms exactly like this one, and she had understood what those rooms were for less than she'd understood anything in her adult life. She understood it completely now. The men at the table ranged from their late 50s to their early 70s. She had studied all of them in the 2 days of preparation, cross-referencing the names from Damien's network documentation with public records, corporate filings, and the kind of secondary financial information that was technically public but practically invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. 2 were heads of families she knew Adrian had existing relationships with. Not alliances exactly, but the kind of mutual recognition that functions as a stay of conflict. 2 were shipping magnates whose names appeared in Damien's network in the cluster she had identified as logistics infrastructure. 1 was a man named Caruso, whose legal name was attached to 3 legitimate construction companies in New England, and whose operational name appeared in Damien's records as a payment recipient for services she had categorized, conservatively, as enforcement. The 6th was a man she did not recognize from any record she had reviewed. That troubled her immediately. She noted it and said nothing. The dinner proceeded through its first hour with the kind of civilized surface tension that she had learned to read during the Damien years. Conversation that moved across topics without landing on any of them. Each exchange a probe for information rather than communication, every statement assessed for what it revealed about the speaker's position before the actual subject was raised. Wine was poured. Food arrived. Nobody ate with any particular appetite. Adrian controlled the table with a quality she was watching for the first time from the outside rather than experiencing as the person he was directing it toward. He moved the conversation incrementally, each pivot deliberate, never appearing to steer, creating the impression that the subjects were arising naturally when in fact he was sequencing them with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. She watched the men at the table respond to it and understood, with a clarity that was almost academic, why he had survived everything he had survived. He was very, very good at this. 40 minutes in, he shifted. "There's a reason I asked for this meeting," he said. He set his wine glass down and the table registered the change in register immediately. Every man's posture shifted by a degree or two, the social performance suspended. "All of you have a connection to Ashcroft's network. Some of you know the full extent of it. Some of you know only your portion." He paused. "The woman sitting next to me spent 2 weeks extracting the complete financial architecture of that network from Ashcroft's own records." Silence. One of the shipping men, a heavyset man named Vasiliev, whose name appeared in 3 of the logistics clusters, looked at Serena with an expression that was not threatening exactly, but was the precursor to threatening. "Who is she?" "She was going to be Ashcroft's wife," Adrian said. "She's the person who decided not to be." "Why is she here?" "Because she built what I'm about to show you." He nodded at Serena. She opened the laptop she had carried in a case from the car, connected it to a small projector Adrian's people had already positioned at the end of the table, and brought up the first page of the presentation. She walked them through it in 30 minutes. She didn't editorialize. She didn't make arguments. She let the documentation speak in the language these men understood, which was the language of exposure. What could be proven? What connected to what? And what the legal consequence of each connection represented. She watched their faces as the picture assembled itself, and she watched the moment, different for each man, when the abstract became personal. When the number on the screen was their number, when the account was their account, when the name in the transfer chain was a name they recognized as their own. Caruso, the construction man, interrupted her twice with questions that were testing for weakness in the documentation rather than seeking information. She answered both without looking away from the screen, citing the specific transaction records, and he stopped interrupting. When she finished, the room was quiet long enough that she could hear the restaurant noise from the other side of the wall. The ordinary sound of people eating dinner without any awareness of what was being discussed 8 feet away. The man she didn't recognize spoke first. "This assumes the documentation is authentic," he said. His voice was very quiet and had an accent she couldn't immediately place. Not regional American, not European in any way she could specify. Something else. "It's authentic," she said. "You took it from Ashcroft's own system." "Yes." "And he knows you took it." "He knew within 40 minutes of when I left." The man nodded slowly. He had a narrow face and pale eyes, and the kind of physical stillness that was different from Adrian's stillness. Where Adrian's calm was the product of controlled power, this man's stillness felt like the absence of something that should have been there. "Then he also knows you brought it here." She felt something shift in the room before she understood why. "Ashcroft doesn't know the location of this meeting," Adrian said. His voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but with a different quality underneath it. Alert. "Nobody in this room communicated with him." "No," the man said. "Nobody in this room communicated with him." The pause. The specific pause of a statement that has ended in exactly the place the speaker intended it to end. Serena looked at Adrian. He was already looking at the man. "Say the rest of it," Adrian said. The man reached into his jacket pocket and placed a phone on the table face up. The screen showed a text message. 3 words. "They're all here." The timestamp was 11 minutes ago. The number it had been sent to was not readable from where Serena sat, but the first 3 digits were visible, and they were not a number she recognized, and the way Adrian's face changed when he saw them told her everything the rest of the digits would have confirmed. "Who sent that?" Adrian said. His voice was absolutely flat. "I did," the man said. The room detonated. Not physically. There was no violence in that first second, just the catastrophic reorganization of every assumption that had structured the past 4 days. Serena's chair scraped back by instinct before she had consciously decided to move. One of Adrian's men appeared in the doorway from the hall. She hadn't known he was positioned there, and apparently neither had the man across the table, because he glanced at the doorway and something passed through his pale eyes that was either miscalculation or the recognition of miscalculation. Adrian stood. "Who are you?" he said, still flat, the flatness of a man holding an enormous amount of pressure behind a surface that had not yet cracked. "My name isn't relevant," the man said. "It will be. What's relevant is that Ashcroft knew about this meeting before the invitations were sent. He's been tracking Moretti family communications for 14 months. Not your phones, your people's phones. Specifically," the man glanced at the doorway where Adrian's man stood. "Specifically, the phone belonging to a man named Enzo Patrice, who has been employed by the Moretti family for 9 years and who has been in contact with Ashcroft's network for the last 7 months. The silence in the room was the kind that happens when everyone present is recalculating simultaneously. Serena watched Adrian's face. She watched him absorb this, watched the specific discipline it required to absorb it without any of it reaching his expression. Enzo Patrice was the name of the man who had been standing outside the dining room door for the past hour. The man who had driven them from the coastal estate to Providence. The man who had, she now understood, been present for every conversation that had taken place inside Adrian's properties for the past 4 days. "Where is he now?" Adrian said. "He left the building 4 minutes ago. And Ashcroft is approximately 20 minutes away." Vasiliev pushed back from the table. "I'm not here for this." "You're already here for it," Serena said, and her own voice surprised her, sharp and completely steady. "Your name is in the transfer documentation regardless of whether you stay in this room. Ashcroft getting to this location doesn't help you. It just means the person who can demonstrate your exposure to federal investigators is in his custody, rather than still in a position to negotiate on your behalf." Vasiliev looked at her. "She's right," Caruso said quietly. He hadn't moved. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table, looking at the laptop screen which still showed the last page of her presentation. Ashcroft getting the drive doesn't make our names disappear from it. He already has the originals. All he gets from taking these two is the ability to control when and whether the exposure becomes federal. Which he will use, Serena said, the same way he used the debt structure against my father. The same way he used the co-investment against the Moretti family. He will use the documentation as leverage to maintain every relationship in that network indefinitely. You will spend the rest of your professional lives operating at the discretion of Damien Ashcroft. The room was very quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet from before. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of men doing serious arithmetic. The unknown man was watching her with his pale eyes and an expression she still could not read. "Who are you?" she said to him directly. "Someone Ashcroft sent to confirm the meeting was real." He paused. "I've been inside Damien's organization for 11 months. She stared at him. "Federal," Adrian said. It was not a question. "Financial crimes enforcement?" The man reached into his other jacket pocket and placed a credential wallet on the table. "Agent Declan Ross. I've been building the Ashcroft case for 14 months. The problem is that every time we get close to evidence, it disappears. Witnesses recant. Documents get sealed. Investigators get transferred." He looked at Serena. "Until 3 days ago, when someone copied 47 screens of primary documentation and walked out of a penthouse in a wedding dress." Serena looked at the credential, then at his face. "You sent Ashcroft a message telling him we were here," she said. "I sent Ashcroft a message that said what he needed to hear to keep him from burning his entire network tonight," Ross said. "He has a protocol. If he believes his exposure has reached a critical threshold, he executes a data destruction sequence that eliminates every piece of documentation connecting him to the criminal architecture. We have been trying to get ahead of that protocol for 11 months. He paused. "The message I sent buys us approximately 40 minutes before he realizes the situation on the ground doesn't match what I told him. After which," Adrian said, "after which he executes the destruction sequence and we lose everything except what's on your drive." Ross looked at both of them. "Which is not enough for federal prosecution without the corroborating records from his primary server." Serena felt the floor of the situation shift under her. The way floors shift when the thing you thought was solid reveals itself to be suspended over something much deeper. She had spent 4 days believing the drive was the leverage. The drive was not the leverage. The drive was evidence of the existence of records. But the records themselves, the primary server documentation that would make a federal case irrefutable, were still in Damien's control. And Damien was 20 minutes away. And the man who had been Adrian's most trusted driver for 4 days had been transmitting their location to Damien's network for the past 7 months. "What do you need?" she said to Ross. "Access to the primary server," he said. "Physical access. The server isn't networked. It's air-gapped, meaning it can't be reached remotely. Someone has to be physically present at the location." "Which location?" He looked at her steadily. "The same building where Ashcroft originally planned to be married. His organization maintains a secondary operations center in the infrastructure beneath the Whitmore, has for 12 years. The wedding was scheduled there because Ashcroft wanted his primary records within physical reach during what he anticipated might be a volatile week, the week when his new wife began her professional role in his corporate structure." Serena sat back in her chair. The Whitmore. The hotel where she had dressed in an ivory wedding gown 3 days ago. The hotel where 400 guests had waited in a ballroom while she walked out a service door. The hotel she had been so focused on leaving that she had not thought about what might be underneath it. "He built his operations center under the hotel," she said, 12 years ago, during the renovation. "And the primary server is there." "Yes." "And you need someone to get inside it." Ross looked at her with the pale eyes and the unreadable expression and said nothing. She looked at Adrian. Adrian was already looking at her with an expression that contained, for the first time since her dressing room 3 days ago, something that was not entirely controlled, something around the edges of his composure that looked like the specific kind of fear that is not fear for yourself. "No," he said. "I'm the only one who can walk back into that building without triggering his security," she said. "I was a guest there for 3 days. The staff knows my face. The security system has my biometrics from the room check-in." "Damien will have flagged your biometrics." "Maybe. Or maybe he hasn't, because flagging them creates a record that his security team would question, and the last thing Damien wants right now is his own people asking questions. She held Adrian's gaze. He's 20 minutes away, Adrian. Whatever we're going to decide, we need to decide it in the next 4 minutes. The restaurant made its sounds on the other side of the wall. The projector hummed. The men at the table sat in the suspended stillness of people watching a decision get made that they understand will determine the next several years of their lives. Adrian looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was not supposed to have seen, the one that lived under all the composure and calculation, the one that was just a man looking at the one person in the world he could not afford to lose again, and understanding that she was about to walk directly toward the thing most likely to take her from him. He looked at Ross. "If anything happens to her inside that building," he said very quietly, "there is no version of federal protection that keeps you safe from me." Ross held his gaze without flinching. "Understood." Adrian looked back at Serena. Something moved through his face. A decision being made at a depth below the one where decisions normally get made, in the place where all the years of careful control had never fully reached. "I'll be 2 minutes behind you," he said. And Serena Holloway picked up her laptop, straightened her charcoal dress, and walked toward the door of the private dining room and the night beyond it, moving back toward the building she had escaped 3 days ago, back toward the man who had built his empire on 23 years of other people's silence, carrying nothing except the full understanding of what he had done and what it had cost, and the cold, absolute certainty that she was done paying for it. The car Ross had waiting outside the restaurant was a black sedan with government plates that had been painted over, the kind of invisible vehicle that existed specifically to not be remembered. Serena got in the back. Ross got in the front passenger seat. The driver, a woman in her 30s with short hair, and the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work long enough to have stopped finding it remarkable, pulled out before the door was fully closed. Adrian's car was 30 seconds behind them. Serena sat in the back seat and looked at her hands. They were steady. She had expected them to be shaking, and they were not, which told her something about what the past 4 days had done to her nervous system, recalibrated it toward a baseline she did not entirely recognize as her own. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and thought about the building. The Whitmore was 43 stories. The public lobby occupied the ground floor and mezzanine. The guest floors ran from 2 through 38. The top 5 floors were private, event spaces, the penthouse tier, the grand ballroom on 39, where 400 guests had waited 3 days ago for a wedding that did not happen. And below the ground floor, in the infrastructure that most hotels accumulated over a century of renovation and expansion, mechanical systems, storage, the bones of the original building buried under layers of modernization, Damien Ashcroft had built a room that did not exist on any public schematic. Ross had given her the access route in the car. Service entrance on the west side, sub-basement 2. A door marked electrical that was not an electrical room. The door required a keycard and a 6-digit code. He had given her both. He had also told her that the keycard was valid for another 22 minutes, after which Damien's security rotation changed and the access credentials would cycle. "What happens if the credentials cycle while I'm inside?" she had asked. "The door locks from the outside," Ross had said. "You'd need to be extracted." She had not asked what extraction looked like in that context. She had understood it was not a clean answer. The Whitmore appeared through the car window at the end of the block, its facade lit against the February night, the entrance canopy still in place, the doormen moving with the practiced unhurriedness of staff managing a building that had not publicly acknowledged any disruption. From the street it looked like any other night. She knew the lobby would still have event staff in it. The wedding infrastructure, the florals, the linens, the temporary lighting rigs, had not been removed yet. There had been no official cancellation. Damien had not canceled the wedding. He had simply begun looking for her. The car stopped half a block from the service entrance. 14 minutes, Ross said. He didn't turn around. The server room has a single terminal. You need to run the extraction protocol on a drive. He passed a drive back over the seat. Smaller than the one she had, matte black with a single indicator light. Insert it, run the executable that auto-launches, and wait for the light to turn green. That's full extraction. It takes between 4 and 7 minutes, depending on file volume. And if someone's in the room? There shouldn't be. His security presence in the sub-basement is light. It's supposed to be invisible, which means minimal staffing. Shouldn't be, she said. I can't give you a guarantee. She looked at the drive in her hand. 4 days ago, she had been standing in an ivory dress, staring at herself in a mirror. She thought about that woman briefly, and without judgment, the way you think about a version of yourself that existed before a specific piece of information changed everything. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately. She walked toward the service entrance with the pace of someone who belonged there. Not hurried, not hesitant, the specific rhythm of a person on a task within a building they know. The service entrance was a heavy metal door recessed into the building's west face. No signage, a card reader mounted at shoulder height. She pressed the key card to the reader. A pause that lasted long enough for her pulse to register it. Then the green light. She punched in the 6 digits and the lock disengaged with a sound like a held breath releasing. Inside, the service corridor was fluorescent lit and smelled of concrete and cleaning supplies. She moved through it quickly, noting the cameras at the corners, both positioned for coverage of the corridor itself rather than the doorways, which meant there were angles she could use. She took the stairwell at the end of the corridor rather than the service elevator, because elevators created records in building management systems and stairs did not. Subbasement 1 was mechanical systems. The sound of the building's HVAC infrastructure was loud here, a constant industrial breath that covered the sound of her footsteps as she moved through to the stairwell on the far side. She was counting seconds in her head, not consciously. It was something her body had started doing at some point in the past hour, an automatic clock running beneath her conscious attention. Subbasement 2 was quieter. The corridor here was narrower, and the fluorescent lights were on a dimmer setting, casting everything in a slightly yellowed half-light that made the space feel older than the building above it. She moved along the left wall, checking door markings as she passed. Storage. HV, a C, secondary, maintenance. She stopped at the door marked electrical, card reader, 6 digits, green light. She pushed the door open and stepped inside and closed it behind her. The room was approximately 20 feet by 30, climate controlled to a temperature noticeably lower than the corridor outside, the specific cool of a space maintained for equipment rather than human comfort. Server racks ran along 3 walls, black towers with blinking indicator lights, the low, consistent hum of active hardware. In the center of the room, on a freestanding desk, a single terminal screen glowed with a login interface. She was alone. She crossed to the terminal and inserted the drive. The screen registered it immediately, and an executable launched without her having to do anything. Ross's team had built it to auto-run, which meant it was designed for someone operating under time pressure who could not afford to navigate unfamiliar systems. A progress bar appeared, a percentage counter. The drive's indicator light pulsed steady amber. 6%, 7, 8. She stood in front of the terminal and watched the progress bar and listened to the hum of the servers and counted her breaths. She was at 31% when she heard the door. Not the keycard reader. The door itself. The sound of the handle engaging from the outside. The particular mechanical sequence of a lock being operated by someone who had a key. She did not have time to move away from the terminal. She stepped to the side of the server rack nearest the desk, which put a tower of hardware between her and the door, and she stopped moving and stopped breathing with a discipline she had not known she possessed until the moment she needed it. The door opened. 2 men. She could hear it in the footsteps. 2 distinct rhythms, one heavier than the other, both moving with the purposeful efficiency of men conducting a check rather than looking for something specific. She pressed herself against the back of the server rack and looked at the terminal screen from her angle. 44%. The heavier footsteps moved toward the server racks on the far wall. The lighter ones moved toward the center of the room. She heard the lighter man stop, a pause. "Terminal's running something," the lighter man said. Her heart did not speed up. It slowed, which was wrong and right at the same time. The body's specific response to a threat that has become immediate enough to require all available resources. "What kind of something?" the heavy man said from across the room. "File extraction. Recent initiation." A pause. "Someone's in here." The sound of both men moving at once, not toward the door but fanning outward, the practiced movement of people trained to cover a room rather than retreat from it. 51%. She stepped out from behind the server rack. Both men registered her simultaneously. The lighter one, younger, close-cropped hair, a jacket that sat wrong across the left shoulder in the way that jackets sit wrong when there's something under them, had his hand moving before she had fully cleared the rack. The heavier one was older and slower by half a second, and that half second was the one that mattered. "Don't," she said. The younger man's hand stopped. She held up her own hands, empty and open, at shoulder height. She looked at the younger man because he was the faster one. "I'm the woman who was supposed to marry Damien Ashcroft 3 days ago," she said. "My name is Serena Holloway. Your employer knows my face." She kept her voice completely flat and did not let any of the adrenaline into it. "Before either of you does anything, I want you to understand that there are federal agents in this building right now, not approaching, already here. And if this situation ends with me getting hurt in this room, the documentation that makes both of you professionally non-existent gets transmitted automatically." This was not entirely true, but the part about federal agents was true, or would be true in approximately 6 minutes based on what Ross had told her, and the part about documentation was true in a structural sense, if not in the precise automatic sense she had implied. The younger man looked at the older one. The older one was looking at the terminal screen, at the progress bar. 63%. "Call it in," the older man said. The younger man reached for his radio. The door behind them opened so fast it hit the wall. Adrian came through it with 2 of his men immediately behind him, and the room reorganized itself in the half-second of everyone's adjustment. The younger man's hand came up, and Adrian's lead man moved to intercept, and for one moment the room was a geometry of bodies and intentions that could have resolved in several directions at once, none of them clean. "Stand down," Adrian said. He said it at a volume and with a quality that was not a suggestion. The younger man looked at the older man again. The older man, who was doing the arithmetic of his situation, with the visible effort of someone for whom the arithmetic was not resolving favorably, lowered his hand and stepped back. Serena turned to the terminal. 77%. Adrian appeared at her shoulder. She felt him more than saw him, the specific warmth of his presence, the controlled urgency in his breathing that told her he had moved fast to get here. "How long?" he said quietly. "Maybe 2 minutes." "Damien is in the building." She kept her eyes on the screen. "Where?" "Lobby. 2 minutes ago. Ross's people are trying to slow him down, but he has 6 men with him and a direct line to his security team on this floor." He paused. "We have less time than 2 minutes." 88%. The older of Damien's 2 men said, from behind them, "Mr. Ashcroft will be here in 90 seconds. "Be quiet," one of Adrian's men said. 91. 94. She heard the radio on the younger man crackle and a voice come through it, and the voice said a sequence of numbers that meant nothing to her and clearly meant something specific to the men it was directed at, because both of Damien's men shifted their weight at the same moment. 97%. The door opened again. Not fast this time. Controlled. The door opened and Damien Ashcroft walked through it, and the room absorbed his presence, the way rooms absorbed the presence of men who had spent 20 years ensuring that every room they entered registered them as the most consequential person in it. He was dressed in a suit she recognized, dark charcoal, custom, the one he wore for situations he considered important. His face was composed. She had seen that composure across hundreds of dinners, in boardrooms, and at charity events, and across a breakfast table on Sunday mornings, and she had always read it as confidence. She understood now that it was something else. Confidence has warmth underneath it. What Damien wore was the composure of a man who had never, in 23 years of building what he built, encountered a situation he could not resolve to his advantage. He looked at the room, at his 2 men, at Adrian's men, at Adrian, then at Serena. "Serena," he said, as though this were a conversation that had been interrupted rather than a confrontation that had been building for 4 days. She did not answer. He looked at the terminal screen. 99%. His expression changed by a fraction. Not much, Not visibly to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning the specific grammar of his face, but she had, and she saw it. The precise moment when Damien Ashcroft understood that the situation had resolved in a direction he had not accounted for. 100%. The drive's indicator light turned green. She pulled it from the terminal. "Give me that," he said. "No." He looked at her with the composure still in place and something moving underneath it. "You don't understand what you're involved in." "I understand completely," she said. "I've understood completely for 4 days." "Then you understand that what's on that drive doesn't only expose me." He paused. "Your father's name is in those records." "I know." "And Moretti's family connections." "I know that too." "Then you understand that using that drive destroys everyone in this room." She looked at him steadily. The drive was in her hand, and her hand was steady, and she was aware of Adrian standing 2 feet behind her left shoulder and the hum of the servers and the specific quality of the air in a room where every person present understood that the next 30 seconds would determine the shape of what came after. "My father spent the last 3 years of his life servicing a debt to you that he never understood was a trap," she said. "He died believing he had protected me. He hadn't. He delivered me to you in the exact condition you needed me in. Close enough to your operation to be useful, too grateful for the rescue to look carefully at what I'd been rescued into." She let that sit for a moment. "You're right that his name is in those records, and I'm going to live with what that means. But I am not going to protect his memory by letting you continue." Damien looked at her. "Adrian," he said, without looking away from Serena, "you've built something worth protecting. Walk away from this, and I give you my word that the Moretti family's connection to my network disappears from every record I hold." Adrian said nothing. "I'm offering you a clean exit," Damien said. His voice had taken on a quality that she recognized, the specific register he used when he was making an offer he fully expected to be accepted, the voice of a man accustomed to being the most rational option in any room. "Take it." "The last person who took one of your clean exits was Thomas Holloway," Adrian said. "I watched what that cost him." The composure on Damien's face shifted. His right hand moved. She didn't see the weapon until it was already raised. A compact, suppressed, the kind of thing that lived in a jacket holster engineered specifically to make it invisible. And it was pointed not at Adrian but at her. And the calculation in Damien's eyes was the calculation of a man who understood leverage and had just reached for the one piece of it remaining. "The drive," he said. His voice had lost the boardroom quality entirely. What was underneath it was older and colder and finally honest. "Now." She held the drive. Adrian moved. He moved the way she had watched him move in the dressing room 4 days ago, and in the coastal house, and in Providence, with the economy of someone for whom physical action was a language as fluent as any other. And he was between her and the gun before she had processed the decision to move herself, his left hand going for Damien's weapon arm with a grip that was not gentle, and the room erupted. The gun discharged into the ceiling. The suppressor reduced it to a sound like a heavy book dropped on a hard floor. Plaster. The acrid, specific smell of a discharged weapon in a closed space. Adrian had Damien's wrist in both hands now and was driving it toward the floor. And Damien was not small and not untrained, and was fighting it with the focused violence of a man who had not built 23 years of criminal empire by being passive when threatened. One of Damien's men moved toward them. Adrian's lead man intercepted him, and the collision of the 2 bodies against the server rack on the right wall was loud enough to vibrate the hardware and send one of the indicator lights cycling into an error pattern. Serena stepped back against the terminal desk and put the drive in her coat pocket. The second of Damien's men was looking at her. "Young man," hand moving toward his jacket. "Federal agents." Ross's voice from the doorway, sharp and carrying the specific authority of someone who had said those words in rooms like this before. Nobody moves. 3 agents behind him. The room was suddenly very crowded and very still. The way rooms go still when the introduction of a specific kind of authority freezes every independent calculation that's been running. Damien and Adrian were still locked together in the center of the room, Damien's gun arm driven down and controlled, both men breathing hard, neither willing to be the first to concede the physical position. "Ashcroft," Ross said. "It's over." Damien looked at him, then at the agents, then at the room, at his two men with their hands now visible, at Adrian's men against the wall, at Serena standing at the terminal desk with her hand in her coat pocket. And then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He laughed. Not the social laugh she had heard across 3 years of dinners. A real one, short, without humor, the laugh of a man who has reached the end of a calculation and found the result genuinely surprising. "You used the federal wire as cover," he said to Ross. 11 months. That's... He stopped, shook his head once. "Release the weapon," Ross said. Adrian stepped back. Damien's hand opened and the gun remained in Adrian's grip, and Damien straightened his jacket with his free hand, a gesture so automatic it was almost comedic given the circumstances. The reflex of a man whose identity had been built on composure for so long that the reflex survived even this. "There's a destruction sequence," Damien said. He said it to the room at large very calmly. "It was initiated 40 seconds ago. Remote trigger, tied to a biometric monitor I've been wearing since this morning. My system read the environmental stress signature and executed automatically." He looked at the server racks. "Everything on those servers is currently being overwritten." The room went very quiet. Ross moved to the terminal. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face that Serena read immediately and accurately. He was looking at a system in the process of active deletion, and the progress was already substantial. She pulled the drive from her pocket. "The extraction completed before he entered the room," she said. She held it up. Ross looked at it, then at her, then at the servers behind her. The indicator light on the drive was green and steady and unambiguous, and Damien Ashcroft stood in the center of the room in his charcoal suit looking at that small green light with the expression of a man watching 23 years of careful architecture come apart at the foundation. Not with rage, not with the desperate energy of someone who still believes a situation can be recovered, but with the specific stillness of a man who has finally run out of moves. "Cuff him," Ross said. While the agents moved, Serena became aware of Adrian. He had stepped back from the center of the room and was standing near the door, and he was holding his right side with his left hand in a way that had not been there before. A careful, deliberate pressure. The kind of pressure you apply to something that is hurting in a way you are managing rather than acknowledging. She crossed to him. "You're hurt," she said. "It's fine." She moved his hand and looked. The charcoal of his suit jacket was darker along the right side, a spreading darkness, and she understood what she was looking at before she fully processed the implication of the gun discharging in the closed space and the angle of Damien's arm before Adrian had controlled it. "You're shot," she said. "Grazed," he said. "Adrian, I'm standing," he said. "I'm fine." He said it with the specific flatness of a man who means both things simultaneously. "I am currently upright, and I am absolutely not going to let you see how much this costs me right now." She looked at his face. The composure was there, but it was working harder than she had ever seen it work, and underneath it was something she had not seen on him before. The naked, unguarded expression of a man who has just been reminded that he is not, in fact, invulnerable, and who finds the reminder more frightening than the injury itself, because the injury is his and the fear is for someone else entirely. Behind them, the agents were moving Damien Ashcroft toward the door, and the servers were completing their self-destruction sequence, and somewhere above them in the hotel, the ghost of a wedding that had never been real was finally beginning to dissolve. Serena kept her hand pressed against Adrian's side, feeling the warmth of blood against her palm, and she did not move it, and he did not ask her to. The ambulance that Ross called took 11 minutes to arrive. Serena knew this because she counted. It was the same automatic clock that had been running in her body since Providence, the one that had started when the situation became physical and had not stopped since. And she stood in the service corridor outside the server room with her hand pressed against Adrian's side and counted the seconds because counting was something to do with the part of her mind that was not focused on the pressure beneath her palm and the warmth that kept coming through it despite the pressure. Adrian sat on the floor with his back against the corridor wall. He had not wanted to sit. She had told him to sit, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man preparing to argue, and she had said his name once, just his name, and something in the way she said it reached the place below all his training and his composure and his 20 years of refusing to be the person in the room who showed weakness, and he sat. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know." She kept the pressure even. "It went through the jacket. I can't tell the depth." "I've had worse." "That's not as reassuring as you think it is." He was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed around them, the infrastructure of the building doing what it always did, indifferent to everything happening inside it. "The drive," he said. "I have it." Ross has what he needs," she said. "Be quiet." He looked at her with an expression that contained, briefly and without armor, something she had been waiting 5 years to see clearly. Not love as a declaration, not love as a decision. Love is the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent an enormous amount of time and effort trying not to need the person in front of him, and has finally, in a corridor in a sub-basement with a bullet wound in his side, run completely out of the resources required to keep pretending otherwise. He reached up with his left hand and touched her face. His fingers were cold. She turned her face slightly into his palm, the way you turn toward warmth without deciding to. "I'm sorry about the letter," he said. She looked at him. "We'll talk about the letter later." "I need to say it now." "Adrian, later." He lowered his hand. His eyes closed for a moment, and she watched his jaw tighten against whatever the wound was doing, and then he opened his eyes again and she was still there, and some of the tension left his face. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. He was in surgery for 4 hours. Serena sat in the waiting area of the hospital on a plastic chair that had no particular relationship with human comfort and drank 3 cups of machine coffee that tasted like hot water that had been shown a picture of coffee, and she waited. Ross came and sat across from her at the 2-hour mark. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours, which she suspected was accurate. "How is he?" Ross said. "In surgery." "The bullet?" "Lodged. Not as clean as he thought." She looked at her hands. The blood on her right palm had dried. She had not washed it off. She wasn't sure why. "The extraction worked." "Yes." "Everything on the drive?" "Everything. Corroborating records, transaction chains, the full payment network." He paused. "It'll take the department 18 months to fully process what you pulled. But the framework is complete. Every name in Damien's network is documented with primary source evidence." She nodded slowly. "Your father's name is in the records," Ross said. "I know. The activity connected to him, the investigator redirections, is documented." He paused. "I want you to understand what the department intends to do with that." She looked at him directly for the first time since he had sat down. "He's dead," Ross said. "The department has no interest in prosecuting a dead man. The documentation will be sealed as part of the investigative record. It won't appear in any public filing." He held her gaze. "I can't give you that in writing, but I'm telling you clearly." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face with the same attention she had learned to bring to financial documents, looking for the place where the surface diverged from the structure underneath. She found nothing. He meant it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and stood and left, and she sat alone with the machine coffee and the plastic chair and the dried blood on her palm and the particular quality of silence that hospital waiting rooms have at 3 in the morning, which is the silence of people suspended between one version of their lives and the next, waiting to find out which way the weight will fall. Adrian came out of surgery at 4:47 in the morning. The surgeon, a compact woman in her 50s who delivered information with the economy of someone who had been doing it for a long time, told Serena that the bullet had been removed cleanly, that there was no organ damage, that he would be in significant pain for several weeks and would need to restrict activity for a minimum of 6, and that he was currently in recovery and could have 1 visitor. Serena walked into the recovery room and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at him. He was awake. Barely, but awake. The specific wakefulness of someone surfacing from anesthesia, present enough to orient but not yet fully in possession of everything. His eyes found her and stayed there. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "Yes." "What time is it?" "Almost 5. He processed this slowly. "How long was I?" 4 hours. You're fine. No organ damage." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. The drive. Ross has it. It's done, Adrian. It's over. He closed his eyes. The lines of his face were different without the composure actively maintaining them. Older, she thought, and more real, and she found she preferred it. She reached out and put her hand over his left hand where it rested on the blanket, and he turned his hand over without opening his eyes and held hers, and neither of them said anything, and the hospital moved around them in its quiet, efficient way. And outside the windows of the recovery room, the February sky was beginning to lighten in the east, with the particular gray that precedes dawn. Not beautiful exactly, but honest, the sky doing what it always did, regardless of what had happened on the ground beneath it. The weeks that followed were not quiet in any external sense. They were the weeks of consequence, the grinding institutional machinery of federal investigation, turning everything Damian Ashcroft had built into the raw material of prosecution. Serena was interviewed 7 times by 4 different agencies over the course of 3 weeks. She gave the same account each time with the same precision, citing the same records in the same sequence, and the agents who interviewed her said very little in response, but made notes with the focused attention of people who understood they were working with primary source material. She was not charged with anything. Ross had been thorough in his documentation of her role, and the evidence of her own victimization within Damian's network, the debt structure, the engineered engagement, the intended use of her professional credentials, was clean and unambiguous. Damian was charged on 41 counts across 3 federal jurisdictions. His lawyers were excellent and expensive, and the process would take years. But the evidence was primary source, complete, and extracted from his own documentation, the irony of which she understood perfectly and felt no need to comment on. The men from the Providence dinner resolved themselves in the ways that men in their position typically resolve when faced with the choice between cooperation and exposure. Vasiliev cooperated within 72 hours. Caruso took 2 weeks and a conversation with his own lawyer before cooperating. The others followed in sequence, each one calculating the same arithmetic and arriving at the same conclusion. Damian's network did not collapse dramatically. It unraveled, slowly, methodically, one severed connection at a time, the way structures built on concealment unravel when the concealment is removed. Adrian recovered at the coastal estate. Serena stayed. This was not a decision that was announced or discussed. On the 3rd day after his discharge from the hospital, when the car brought them back to the stone house above the Atlantic, she carried her bag inside and put it in the room she had used during the first days, and nobody said anything about it. And on the 4th day, she was working at the dining table when he came downstairs for the first time and sat across from her with his coffee and looked at what she was working on and asked a question about one of the federal filings. And she answered it, and they worked together at the table for 2 hours. And that was, she thought, more honest than any declaration would have been. He was a difficult patient. This she had expected. He pushed against the physical restrictions with the specific frustration of a man for whom physical capability was functional rather than ego-driven. He needed to be able to move, to operate, to be the person in the room who could respond to whatever the room required. And 6 weeks of enforced limitation was not something his nervous system accepted easily. She watched him work through it with a patience that surprised her. Not the patience of someone managing another person's behavior, but the patience that comes from understanding what something costs. She understood what limitation cost him. She understood it because she had watched him absorb the cost of every limitation he had ever chosen for the sake of other people. And she had been, without knowing it, one of those limitations for 5 years. They talked about the letter on the 12th day. It was evening. The fire was going. The ocean outside was doing what it did, and the light in the room was the particular amber of firelight on old stone walls. And she had been sitting in the chair nearest the fire with a book she was not reading when he said, from the couch across from her, "I want to tell you about the letter." She put the book down. "All 6 versions," she said. "The first one was honest," he said. He was looking at the fire rather than at her. "It said everything. Why I was leaving, what I was going back to, what keeping you close would mean for your safety given what I was walking into." He paused. It was 4 pages. "What happened to it?" "I burned it." He looked at her then. "Because if you had read it, you would have understood the situation well enough to make a rational decision about whether to wait." And I didn't want you to wait. I needed you to move on, which meant I needed you to be angry enough or hurt enough that waiting didn't feel like a rational option. He paused. So I kept rewriting it until everything that would have made it comprehensible was gone, until it was just final. She held his gaze. That was a decision you made for me. Yes, without asking me what I wanted. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The fire did what fires do. I was angry at you for a long time, she said. Not the way people are angry when they're hurt. The specific anger of someone who has been managed, who has had a decision made on their behalf by someone who decided they knew better. She paused. I think that anger was correct. It was, he said. And I also think, she said more slowly, that you were 29 years old and in the middle of a war inside your own family, and you were trying to do the least damaging thing available to you with the information you had. She looked at the fire. People don't always make the right decision under those conditions. They make the decision that looks survivable from where they're standing. He was watching her. I'm not absolving you, she said. I'm contextualizing you. There's a difference. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. I looked for you, he said. After the internal war resolved, 18 months later, I had someone locate you without making contact. He stopped. You were with Damien by then, had been for 4 months. She stared at him. You were with him for 3 years, he said, and I watched from a distance and I told myself you had moved on, which was what I had intended and that I should leave it. And then 6 months before your wedding, I started seeing his name in financial intelligence reports, in a context that had nothing to do with his legitimate business, and I understood what you had walked into. He paused. I was already in New York when you sent the message. You were already here. I was trying to figure out how to get you out of it without, he stopped, without me knowing you'd been watching. Yes. She sat with this, the full shape of the past 5 years reassembling itself around this new information, not changing what had happened, but changing the negative space around it, the absences and silences that she had filled with her own interpretations for so long that the interpretations had calcified into assumed fact. You should have called me, she said. I know. When you found out about Damien, you should have called me. I know that too. He looked at his hands. I was afraid that if I called you, you would tell me to stay out of it. That you were fine, that you didn't need... He stopped again. That I didn't need you, she said. Yes. She looked at him across the firelit room, at the man who had spent 5 years making decisions from a place of fear that he would never have named as fear, who had built an entire architecture of control and distance around the one place where he had no control at all, which was the simple fact of what she meant to him. I would have told you to stay out of it, she said. He looked at her. Probably, she said. If you'd called me 6 months ago and told me you'd been watching and that Damien wasn't what he appeared to be, I would have been angry and I would have told you to stay out of my life. She paused. And I would have started looking at his records myself within a week, because that's what I do. And I would have found the same things I found. She looked at the fire. It might have gone better. It might have gone worse. We'll never know. No, he said. We won't. The fire settled and the room was warm, and outside the Atlantic moved in the dark with its old indifferent consistency. And Serena thought about what it meant to stop reconstructing the past and simply inhabit the present, not as a philosophy, but as a practical necessity, the way you make practical necessities out of the things you cannot change. In the weeks that followed, Adrian began the work of dismantling the operational structure of the Moretti family's criminal enterprises. This was not a dramatic or a sudden thing. It was slow and careful and conducted with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, identifying which operations could be transitioned into legitimate structures, which relationships could be renegotiated on legal terms, which aspects of the family's reach could be preserved through the transformation and which could not. He did not pretend it was simple. He did not pretend that 20 years of criminal infrastructure dissolved without cost. There were men who had served the family for decades who would not make the transition, and those separations were handled with the specific combination of firmness and fairness that was the only approach that didn't create new problems while solving old ones. He brought Serena into the financial architecture of the transition, not because he needed her help. He had capable people, but because he understood and told her directly that he was done making decisions about things that affected both of them without her. She audited the legitimate operations with the same rigor she brought to everything and found 3 areas where the transition plan had structural weaknesses that would have created legal exposure within 2 years. She fixed them. He watched her work and said nothing, which was his version of gratitude. Claire called in the 4th week. Serena answered. The conversation was long and honest and uncomfortable in the specific way that conversations are uncomfortable when 2 people have known each other for a long time, and one of them has just revealed that her life was significantly different from what the other one understood it to be. Claire was not angry. She was something more complicated than angry, hurt and relieved, and full of the retrospective anxiety of someone cataloging 3 years of dinners and events and conversations and understanding that she had been present for the edges of something without seeing its shape. "Are you okay?" Claire said. "I'm getting there." "Are you safe?" "Yes." A pause. "The man. Moretti." "Yes." "I looked him up." "I know what you found." "Serena." "Claire." She paused. "I know what the public record says about him. The public record is incomplete." She paused again. "He took a bullet for me in a sub-basement in Midtown." A long silence. "Okay," Claire said finally. "Okay. I want to meet him." "You will." She did 2 months later at a dinner in the stone house that was ordinary in all the ways that mattered: food, wine, the specific texture of people trying to take the measure of each other across a table with honesty rather than performance. Claire watched Adrian for 2 hours with the focused attention of a woman who loved Serena and was determined to form her own opinion regardless of what she'd been told. At the end of the evening, when Adrian had gone to deal with a call, Claire looked at Serena across the table and said, "He watches you the way people watch things they're afraid of losing." "I know," Serena said. "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not." The formal legal resolution of Damien Ashcroft's case took 14 months. The trial itself was 3 weeks long and received the kind of coverage that financial crimes cases rarely receive because the architecture of what he had built was genuinely extraordinary, not in its ambition, which was commonplace among men of his type, but in its execution, the 2 decades of careful construction that had embedded criminal infrastructure inside legitimate systems at every level. The federal prosecutor described it, in her opening statement, as the most comprehensive financial criminal enterprise prosecuted in the past 30 years. Serena testified on the 4th day. She sat in the witness box in a gray suit and answered questions for 6 hours with the precision she had brought to every forensic consultation she had ever conducted. And she did not look at Damien across the courtroom more than twice. And both times she found him watching her with the composed expression she had known across 3 years of a relationship that had never been what she thought it was. And both times she held his gaze until he looked away first. She was not angry at him. She understood this about herself without being entirely comfortable with it. What she felt toward Damien Ashcroft was something closer to the recognition you feel toward a natural disaster. Not moral judgment, because moral judgment requires the assumption of alternative choices that the thing in question could have made. And she was not sure Damien had ever been capable of the alternative. He had been built by 23 years of his own choices into something that could only function one way, and that way had finally intersected with the one variable he had not accurately assessed. He had not accurately assessed her. Damien was convicted on 37 of the 41 counts. He would not leave federal custody for a minimum of 22 years, and the asset seizures connected to his network would continue for years beyond that. It was not a complete accounting. It never was. But it was substantial and documented and permanent, and the men who had built their own operations in the shelter of his would spend the next decade navigating the consequences of having done so. In the 6th month, Adrian and Serena left New York. They drove to the coastal estate first, not to stay but to close it properly. The way you close a place where something significant happened when you are ready to stop returning to it. She walked through the rooms where she had spent 2 days building the presentation that had changed everything, and she stood at the dining table where she and Adrian had gone through the full architecture of Damien's network for the first time, and she put her hand on the table's surface for a moment, and then she lifted it and walked out. The villa in Portugal was Adrian's in the way that several properties were Adrian's, through holding structures that were being systematically transitioned as part of the broader reorganization of the family's assets. It sat above the Atlantic coast south of Lisbon, behind a white wall covered in bougainvillea that would bloom in spring, in a village small enough that strangers were noticed, but old enough that it had seen enough strangers to stop being surprised by them. They arrived in February, exactly 1 year after a morning in Manhattan when Serena Holloway had stood in an ivory dress and understood that the life she had been building was constructed on a foundation of someone else's design. The first weeks were quiet in a way that took adjustment, not the held-breath quiet of the coastal estate with its perimeter rotations and locked drawers and the constant background awareness of threat. Actual quiet, the quiet of a place where the most significant sounds were wind and water and the village going about its ordinary life on the other side of the wall. Adrian walked the property's boundaries every morning out of habit, but the habit relaxed over time into something that looked more like a walk than a security assessment. And she watched this happen without comment and found it the most hopeful thing she had seen in years. She consulted remotely. The forensic work that had been her profession for a decade translated cleanly into an independent practice that required nothing more than her expertise, her reputation, which had been considerably elevated by her role in the Ashcroft case, and an internet connection. She worked mornings at a table near the south window that looked out over the Atlantic and found that the work was better here, quieter in the mind, if not in the conclusions. The distance from the environments where she had always conducted it, giving her a clarity she hadn't known was available. He ran the legitimate restructuring of the Moretti family's operations from the same house, in a different room, with a different laptop and a different set of calls at different hours. They occupied the same space as people who have learned to work near each other without requiring the work to be shared, parallel rather than merged, which was, she thought, the correct architecture for two people who had each built significant independent capacity and did not need to dissolve it into each other to be together. They cooked dinner together most evenings. This was the ordinary detail she held on to when she thought about what had changed. Not the large things, the case and the testimony and the year of consequence, but the specific ordinary detail of standing in a kitchen in Portugal in the early evening with the Atlantic light coming through the window and the smell of garlic in a pan, and the sound of him moving behind her and the ease of it, the complete absence of the calculation that had been present in every interaction she had ever had with Damien, the constant background assessment of what was safe to reveal, what to perform, what to manage. There was no management here. There was just the kitchen and the garlic and the light. On a morning in late spring, when the bougainvillea had come into full bloom and the Atlantic was doing something extraordinary with the early light, silver and gold, and a blue that had no name in any color system she had studied, she was sitting on the terrace with her second coffee when Adrian came outside and sat across from her and was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was working up to something. She waited. He reached into the pocket of the shirt he wore in the mornings. Simple, dark, the kind of shirt that cost nothing and looked like everything. And placed something small on the table between them. A ring. Not elaborate. A single stone in a setting that was clean and simple and looked like something chosen by a person who understood that she would not want the thing that announced itself. He looked at her. "I had a version of this speech," he said. "I've been working on it for 3 weeks. What happened to it?" "The same thing that happened to the first version of the letter," he said. "Everything that was careful and arranged felt wrong, so I'm just going to say it plainly." He paused. "Marry me." She looked at the ring, then at his face, at the man who had spent 5 years protecting her from a distance and 2 years rebuilding himself into someone who could offer what he was offering now, which was not safety exactly, and not certainty exactly, but presence. Complete and unmanaged presence, with nothing held back and no version of a letter that removed the hope. She thought about her father. She thought about him in the way she had learned to think about him, with grief and understanding in equal measure, without the weight of the unanswerable question of what he had known and when. He had tried to protect her with the tools he had. He had been imperfect. He had loved her completely. She could hold all 3 of those things simultaneously now, and she found that holding all three was easier than she had expected once she stopped requiring any of them to cancel the others. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers in the Atlantic light. The stone caught the morning and held it. "You disappeared for 5 years," she said. "Yes." "And spent a year watching from a distance." "Yes." "And then showed up in my dressing room with snow on your shoulders and told me to change my clothes." Something moved through his expression, the specific expression she had catalogued over the past year as the one he produced when she said something that surprised him into being amused against his better judgment. "Also, yes," he said. She looked at the ring, and then at the Atlantic, and then at him. "I chose you the day I pressed send," she said. "It just took us 5 years to find our way home." She put the ring on her own finger and reached across the table and put her hand over his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers the way he had held it in the hospital recovery room in the gray hours before dawn, with the specific grip of a man who has run out of reasons to hold back and found, in the running out, that what was on the other side of all that careful restraint was simply this: a terrace and a morning and a woman who had seen the worst of everything he was and was still here, holding his hand in the Atlantic light, with nowhere else to be. The bougainvillea moved in the coastal wind. The water below the cliff did what water does. The village beyond the white wall went about its morning with the unhurried rhythm of a place that had been going about its mornings for 500 years and intended to continue. And Serena Holloway, who had once stood in an ivory dress in a Manhattan hotel room and sent 7 words into the dark without any certainty that anything would come of them, sat in the spring light of the life she had chosen and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, the particular quality of stillness that is not the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness of arrival.